Be defied their rage.
Some honors don't come from medals. They come from memory.
When two event staff tried to remove a Native American Army veteran from his daughter's college graduation, no one anticipated that 5 Green Berets would rise from the crowd, their silent presence shifting the entire auditorium into a moment that would be remembered forever. James Red Hawk eased his weathered Ford F-150 into the parking lot of Westfield State University in Oregon, the morning sun painting the asphalt in shades of gold. The campus was a striking blend of modern architecture and natural beauty. Sleek glass buildings with angular lines stood in harmony with the rugged Cascade Mountains looming in the distance, their peaks capped with late spring snow. It was June 2025, and the air carried the crisp scent of pine, blooming dogwood trees, and the electric hum of anticipation. Families streamed across the lot, their voices a chorus of excitement. Parents in tailored suits adjusting ties, children waving glittered signs proclaiming, "Congrats, grad!" and grandparents clutching programs, their faces etched with pride. James parked near a row of flowering shrubs, the truck's faded red paint bearing scratches from years of cross-country drives. He stepped out, smoothing the crisp lines of his army dress uniform, its olive green fabric adorned with ribbons and medals that whispered of battles fought in distant lands. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, clicked softly against the pavement, not for show, but because James Red Hawk didn't know how to do things halfway. He had driven 10 hours from Boise, Idaho, to be here for his daughter. Ayanna's college graduation. The journey was solitary, the truck's radio playing old country tunes, Johnny Cash and Patsy Cline, that Nora, his late wife, used to sing along to during their road trips. Nora had passed 3 years ago, her absence a quiet ache that lingered in every corner of James's life. He opened the glove box and pulled out a small, dog-eared photo. Nora holding Ayanna at her first powwow, a tiny bundle wrapped in a star quilt, her mother's smile radiant under the summer sun. The edges of the photo were worn, a faint crease running through the corner, but it was a lifeline to a time when their family was whole. James tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform, close to his heart. "We made it, love," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the crowd. She did it. James's walk to the auditorium was slow and deliberate, each step grounding him in the moment. At 46, he carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who'd seen the world's edges, deserts in Iraq, jungles in Central America, and the long, lonely nights of grief that followed Nora's passing. His dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back into a neat braid, a nod to his Lakota heritage. His face, weathered by sun and time, held a stillness that drew glances from passers-by. Some noticed the uniform, the ribbons pinned to his chest. Others noticed the braid, a symbol of a culture that endured despite centuries of challenge. James didn't care about the stares. His focus was on Ayanna, somewhere inside, preparing to cross the stage as a biology major with honors, her future as bright as the mountains on the horizon. The auditorium was a cavernous space, its high ceiling lined with acoustic panels, and its walls draped in blue and gold banners proclaiming, "Class of 2025. Rows of cushioned chairs filled the floor, their navy upholstery creaking under the weight of families settling in. The balcony above was packed with latecomers, their silhouettes outlined against the soft glow of overhead lights. The air smelled of fresh coffee from a concession stand, floral arrangements lining the stage, and the faint tang of polished wood. James handed his ticket to a volunteer at the entrance, a young woman with a clipboard and a nervous smile. She scanned it, her eyes lingering on his uniform before she nodded. "5th row, center. Reserved for families. You're all set." "Thank you," James replied, his voice low but warm, carrying the cadence of someone who spoke only when necessary. He wove through the crowd, navigating clusters of families with practiced ease. A man in a polo shirt whispered to his wife, who glanced at James and quickly looked away. A teenage boy pointed, then dropped his hand when his mother nudged him. A young couple in matching university sweatshirts did a double take, their eyes tracing the medals on his chest. James was used to it, being native, being a soldier, being a man who didn't blend in. He'd faced those looks in small towns, on military bases, at parent-teacher conferences, and even at the VA hospital where Nora spent her final days. They didn't faze him. He found his seat in the 5th row, the chair creaking slightly under his weight. The stage ahead was set with a podium, microphones, and a large screen displaying the university's crest. Faculty in academic robes milled about, adjusting notes and exchanging pleasantries with the dean. James scanned the rows of graduates lining the side of the auditorium, their black gowns rustling as they fidgeted with caps and cords. Ayanna stood out, her cap decorated with intricate beadwork she'd crafted herself, each bead a tiny piece of her Lakota heritage, sewn with care over late-night study sessions. At 22, she had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's quiet intensity. Her eyes, bright with determination, scanned the crowd, searching for him. When their gazes met, she gave a small wave, her smile a mix of nerves and pride. James allowed himself a faint smile, his chest swelling with a feeling he couldn't name. Pride, ache, and something deeper, like the weight of a promise kept. He remembered Ayanna as a toddler, chasing fireflies in their Boise backyard, her laughter echoing through the dusk. He remembered her at 10, reading biology textbooks under a flashlight, determined to understand the world. At 16, she'd sat with him at Nora's bedside, holding her mother's hand as the machines beeped softly. And now, here she was, ready to claim her degree, a testament to her resilience and Nora's unwavering belief in her. The ceremony began with the familiar strains of pomp and circumstance, the music swelling as the crowd rose to their feet. Parents fumbled with programs, some snapping photos, others wiping tears. James stood, shoulders squared, hands at his sides, his posture a silent salute. The national anthem followed, and he remained motionless, his presence a tribute to the flag and to Nora, who'd always sung along off-key but with heart. He thought of her now, how she'd have fussed over Ayanna's cap, adjusting the beadwork until it was perfect, her hands quick and loving. His throat tightened, but his face stayed steady, his eyes locked on the stage where Ayanna stood among her peers. As the anthem faded, 2 event staff approached from the side aisle, their steps clipped and purposeful. They wore black vests with event security stitched in yellow, radios clipped to their belts, and badges identifying them as T. Reynolds and C. Holt. Reynolds was stocky, with a buzz cut and a scowl that seemed etched into his face, his posture rigid with authority. Holt was lean, with a restless energy, his eyes darting around the room as if he'd rather be anywhere else. James noticed them immediately, his instincts honed from years in the army kicking in. He didn't move, but his awareness sharpened, reading their approach like a battlefield, calculating angles and intentions. Reynolds stopped beside James's chair and leaned in, his voice low but firm, carrying a hint of impatience. "Sir, we need you to come with us." James turned his head slightly, his expression calm, unyielding, his dark eyes meeting Reynolds's with a quiet intensity. "Is there an issue?" Holt stepped closer, his tone clipped, his hands fidgeting with the radio on his belt. "This section's reserved for immediate family. There's been a seating mix-up." James reached into his pocket and produced his ticket, holding it out without breaking eye contact. The paper was crisp, printed with his name and seat number in bold font. "5th row, center, family seating. I showed it at the door." Reynolds didn't glance at the ticket, his scowl deepening as if the gesture offended him. "We got word this area's overbooked. There's space in the balcony. You'll have a good view from there." James's voice remained even, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I drove 10 hours to see my daughter graduate. I'm staying here." A few heads turned nearby. A woman with a toddler on her lap frowned and whispered to the man next to her, her eyes narrowing at the staff. A teenager in the row behind angled his phone, maybe recording, maybe just pretending to. Holt shifted his weight, his tone sharper now, a nervous edge creeping in. "Look, it's not personal. We're just following orders. Let's keep this smooth." James's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with clarity. He'd heard that tone before, on bases, in small towns, in moments when orders masked something else. He'd felt it in the glances at gas stations, the whispers in waiting rooms, the subtle nudges that said he didn't belong, because of his skin, his braid, his heritage. "Whose orders?" he asked, his voice steady but pointed, each word deliberate. Reynolds hesitated, his hand twitching toward his radio, his jaw tightening. "School staff, doesn't matter. You need to move." "I'm not moving," James said, his tone final, like a door closing. He turned his gaze back to the stage, dismissing them without a word, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The air thickened, the hum of the crowd fading as nearby rows sensed the tension. The woman next to James, older with silver hair pinned up in a bun, leaned over and murmured, "You stay right there, hon. They've got no right." Her voice was quiet but fierce, her eyes flashing with indignation as she clutched her program. James gave her a slight nod, grateful but focused. He didn't want a scene. He just wanted to see Ayanna walk, to feel Nora's presence in the moment, to keep the promise he'd made to his wife years ago. Holt's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on his radio, a nervous tick betraying his discomfort. "Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice louder now, drawing more eyes. James didn't respond. His silence was louder than any retort, his presence rooted like the mountains outside. Reynolds muttered something into his radio, his tone clipped and urgent, his eyes never leaving James. "Section 5, non-compliant. Need backup," he said, his voice low but audible to those nearby. The crowd's murmur grew, eyes shifting from the stage to the unfolding drama. A man in a suit 2 rows back leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his hands gripping his program. A young woman with a camera paused, her lens subtly turning toward the 5th row, her fingers adjusting the focus. Then the auditorium doors opened with a soft thud, the sound barely noticeable over the music and chatter. 5 men entered, one at a time, each taking a different path through the crowd. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, button-downs, a leather jacket, but their movements were unmistakable. Precise, controlled, like they'd walked through worse than a crowded college graduation. Their postures were erect, their gazes sharp, scanning the room with the instincts of men who'd seen combat. James didn't turn, but he knew who they were. He'd led them through fire and chaos years ago, in places where survival was a coin toss. They were here now, not by chance, but by loyalty, a bond forged in blood and trust. Reynolds and Holt didn't notice the new arrivals at first. They were too focused on James, still hovering, their postures stiff with authority they thought they owned. But the room was starting to shift, the energy tilting like a tide before a storm. A few rows back, a man in a flannel shirt nudged his wife, nodding toward the newcomers. A student in the balcony leaned over the railing, her phone raised, capturing the moment. The ceremony pressed on, names called in a steady rhythm, but the focus near the 5th row was elsewhere. Ayanna, standing among the graduates, caught sight of the 2 staff members looming over her father. Her heart sank, her fingers tightening around her diploma folder until her knuckles paled. She knew that look on his face, still, like a lake before a storm. She'd seen it when she was 15, when a store clerk followed them through aisles, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd seen it at 18, when a neighbor made a comment about their kind moving into the neighborhood, and James had simply walked away, his silence more powerful than any argument. Ayanna's pulse quickened, her eyes darting between her father and the stage. She wanted to run to him, to stand in his defense, to shout at the staff to leave him alone, but she knew he'd want her to stay put, to claim her moment. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the fire in her chest, a mix of pride and fury. James sat unmoved, his hands resting on his knees, his focus locked on the graduates. Reynolds leaned closer, his voice dropping to a hiss, his breath hot against the air. "You're causing a disturbance. Move to the balcony, or we'll have to escalate." James turned his head, his eyes meeting Reynolds's with a quiet intensity that made the other man flinch. "You're the ones making noise. I'm here for my daughter," Holt scoffed, folding his arms, his restlessness giving way to irritation. "This isn't about you. It's about policy." James's voice was steady, cutting through the pretense like a knife through cloth. "Policy doesn't trump my right to be here. You want to talk policy? Get your supervisor." The woman next to James leaned forward again, her voice sharp and clear. "You're embarrassing yourselves," she said to the staff, loud enough for nearby rows to hear. Her words carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around her. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The man in the suit 2 rows back nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with disapproval. A young woman with a camera zoomed in, her hand steady despite the tension, her lens capturing every detail of the standoff. Reynolds's face reddened, his hand dropping to his radio again. "Section 5, situation escalating. Send backup," he muttered, his tone betraying a mix of frustration and unease. The crowd's attention was now split, the ceremony fading into the background as eyes turned toward the 5th row. A father in a baseball cap whispered to his son, "This isn't right." A grandmother in the balcony clutched her purse, her lips pressed tight. Then a voice cut through the hum of the crowd, clear and measured, like a blade slicing through fog. "Is there a reason this man's being harassed?" It came from a man standing in the aisle, tall and broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and a denim jacket. His name was Marcus Tate, a former Green Beret who'd fought alongside James in Fallujah. Marcus didn't raise his voice, but it carried, stopping conversations in a 10-foot radius. His eyes were locked on Reynolds, his posture relaxed but unyielding, like a man who'd faced worse odds and walked away. Reynolds turned, startled, his hand still on his radio. "Who are you?" Marcus stepped forward, his boots heavy on the polished floor, each step deliberate. "I'm the guy asking why you're bothering a father at his daughter's graduation." Holt raised a hand, trying to regain control, his voice cracking slightly. "This is handled, sir. Please sit down." "No," Marcus said, his tone flat but firm, the single word landing like a hammer. "It's not handled." Another man stood, this one from the balcony. Lean, with a scar above his eyebrow, he crossed his arms and stared down at the scene. His name was Eli Navarro, who'd carried a wounded James through a firefight in Colombia, his own hands shaking, but his resolve unbreakable. Then a third man rose, near the back exit, his posture mirroring the others. Caleb Ruiz, who'd shared rations with James in the Iraqi desert, his eyes sharp with memory. Then a fourth, Javier Ortiz, who'd patched James's wounds under fire, his fingers steady despite the chaos. And finally, Sam Keller, whose quiet humor had kept them sane during endless nights in the jungle. They didn't speak, didn't signal each other, but their presence was a wall, unyielding and absolute. The crowd noticed. Whispers spread like wildfire. Phones tilted upward, capturing the moment, their screens glowing in the dim light. James stayed seated, his eyes on the stage, but his awareness was sharp, honed by years of reading rooms and battlefields. He knew these men: Marcus, Eli, Caleb, Javier, and Sam. They'd shared rations, ducked bullets, and carried each other through hell. He'd pulled Marcus from a collapsed building in Fallujah, his hands bleeding as he dug through rubble, bullets snapping overhead. He'd carried Javier 2 miles after a mortar strike left him dazed, his own lungs burning from the effort. He'd stayed on watch, while Eli, Caleb, and Sam held a perimeter against overwhelming odds, their trust in him absolute. These weren't just friends, they were brothers, bound by blood and trust, men who'd seen the worst of the world and chosen to stand together. Reynolds glanced around, his confidence faltering, his eyes darting between James and the men now standing throughout the auditorium. "Look, we're just doing our job," he said, his voice less certain now, a crack in his bravado. "Your job," Marcus said, stepping closer, his voice low and steady, "doesn't include disrespecting a man who's earned his place here." The auditorium wasn't silent, but it was close. The announcer stumbled over a name, her voice faltering as she tried to keep the ceremony on track, but the energy had shifted. Ayanna, still in line, watched it all, her chest tight with pride and anger. She wanted to run to her father, to stand beside him, to shout at the staff to back off, but she knew he'd want her to stay put, to claim her moment. Her hands trembled, her beadwork cap glinting under the stage lights, each bead a reminder of her mother's lessons, her father's strength. Marcus's voice dropped lower, almost a growl, but calm, controlled. "You've got 2 options. Walk away, or this gets bigger than you're ready for." Holt took a step back, his hands up, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "All right, man, let's cool it." But Reynolds wasn't ready to let go. His ego was bruised, his authority challenged in front of a crowd. He pointed at James, his finger inches from his chest, his voice rising. "You think that uniform makes you special? This is a college, not a battlefield." The words landed like a slap, sharp and ugly. The crowd gasped softly, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the rows. James didn't flinch, but his eyes locked onto Reynolds, unblinking, a quiet fire burning behind them. "I don't need a uniform to know who I am," he said, his voice low, each word deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade. "And you don't get to decide where I sit." The woman in the row behind clapped once, sharply, breaking the silence. Others joined in, sporadic at first, then stronger, a wave of applause that wasn't for the graduates, but for James. Marcus didn't move, his gaze pinning Reynolds like a dart. The other Green Berets stood firm, their silence louder than any shout. A young man in the balcony stood, clapping slowly, deliberately, his face set with respect. A mother with a baby joined in, her applause sharp and defiant, her eyes flashing with indignation. A student in a cap and gown turned to his friend and whispered, "That's not right. They can't do that." The room was waking up, the energy shifting from tension to solidarity, a shared understanding that something wrong had been challenged. A faculty member, a woman in a navy blazer with a name tag reading Doctor Ellis, hurried down the aisle, her face pale, her heels clicking against the floor. She whispered urgently to Reynolds and Holt, gesturing toward the exit, her hands moving quickly as if to defuse a bomb. Her words were inaudible, but her tone was firm, her eyes darting nervously between the staff and the crowd. Whatever she said worked. Reynolds shot James one last look, his face flushed with frustration, his jaw tight with defeat, then turned and walked away, Holt trailing behind, his head down. The crowd exhaled, some clapping louder now, others murmuring in approval. A teenager in a hoodie shouted, "That's right," before his father pulled him back into his seat, a proud smile on his face. James didn't react. He sat, still as stone, his eyes returning to the stage, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Marcus gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of a battle won without a single raised voice. The other Green Berets sat down, their movements synchronized, their presence still a quiet force in the room. The moment wasn't over, but it had shifted. The auditorium felt different now, charged with something deeper than a ceremony, a shared understanding of what had just happened, a recognition of dignity in the face of disrespect. The memory hit James like a wave, pulling him back to a night in Fallujah, 2004. The air was thick with dust, and the acrid smell of cordite, the sky a bruised purple above the crumbling marketplace. His unit had been ambushed, pinned down by insurgents, who moved like shadows between the stalls. Bullets chipped stone, and the screams of the wounded mixed with the crack of rifles. James, then a staff sergeant, had been leading a squad when a rocket-propelled grenade tore through their cover, the explosion shaking the ground like a fist. Marcus was trapped under a collapsed wall, his leg pinned, blood pooling beneath him, his face pale but defiant. James didn't hesitate. He crawled through the open, ignoring the rounds snapping overhead, the dust stinging his eyes. He reached Marcus, his hands digging through rubble until his fingers bled, the jagged edges of concrete tearing at his skin. "You're not dying here," he'd growled, his voice steady despite the chaos. He freed Marcus, dragging him to safety behind a burned-out car, his own breath ragged from the effort. Javier was next, dazed from a mortar blast, stumbling in the open, his eyes unfocused. James ran back, pulling him to cover, his arms burning under Javier's weight. Eli was firing from a shattered doorway, refusing to leave until the others were safe, his rifle a steady rhythm against the chaos. Caleb and Sam held the perimeter, their faces blackened with ash, their eyes sharp with focus. When the dust settled, all 5 men were alive, bruised but breathing, their trust in James sealed in that moment. James stayed on watch until the evac chopper arrived, its blades cutting through the night, his rifle steady, his voice calm as he coordinated the extraction. He didn't talk about it afterward. He didn't need to. The men who'd survived that night, Marcus, Eli, Caleb, Javier, and Sam, never forgot. They'd made a pact, unspoken but ironclad. If James ever needed them, they'd be there. No questions asked. Over the years, they'd kept in touch. Emails about kids' birthdays, Christmas cards with handwritten notes, the occasional beer at a veterans reunion in Boise or Denver. When James mentioned Ayana's graduation, a quiet message sent to their group chat. They didn't hesitate. They showed up, not for recognition, but because that's what brothers a teen do. Back in the auditorium, the ceremony rolled on. Names echoed through the speakers, families cheered, but the 5th row was a focal point now, a quiet epicenter of the day's true story. Ayana stood in line, her heart pounding, her beadwork cap glinting under the stage lights. She'd seen her father's calm, seen the men stand for him, and it hit her harder than she expected. She'd grown up with stories, vague ones, about her dad's service. A medal in a drawer, its ribbon faded but heavy with meaning. A photo of him in fatigues, standing in a desert with men she didn't know. A letter from a general she'd never read, tucked in a box in the garage labeled Iraq. Her mother had shared bits and pieces, always with a smile. "Your dad's the strongest man I know, but he'll never tell you that himself." Ayana had nodded, not fully understanding, her child's mind unable to grasp the weight of those words. Now, watching those 5 men rise without hesitation, their presence a silent shield around her father, she felt the weight of his life in a way she never had before. The announcer's voice broke through her thoughts, clear and resonant. "Ayana Redhawk." The room paused, a half-second of silence before the applause erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was thunderous, rhythmic, led by the 5 Green Berets who stood again, their hands coming together, in perfect sync. The sound wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, a salute to Ayanna and her father, a recognition of what this moment meant. The crowd joined in, some standing, some wiping tears, caught up in a moment they didn't fully understand, but felt in their bones. A young man in a cap and gown nearby turned to his friend and whispered, "That's her dad. Did you see what happened?" His friend nodded, his eyes wide with respect. Ayanna crossed the stage, her step steady, her chin high, her beadwork cap catching the light with every movement. Each bead was a story, a connection to her mother's hands, her grandmother's teachings, her people's resilience. She took her diploma, shook the dean's hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her chest. She turned to face the audience, her eyes finding her father, still seated, his face unreadable but his eyes bright with pride. She gave him a small nod, and he returned it, a silent promise kept between them, a bridge between past and present. The applause didn't fade until she stepped off the stage, her heart pounding not from nerves, but from the realization of what this moment meant, not just for her, but for her father, her mother's memory, and the men who stood for them both. The ceremony continued, but the energy had changed. Every student who walked after Ayanna carried a piece of that moment, a reminder that some things, honor, loyalty, family, were bigger than a stage or a diploma. The crowd clapped louder now, as if trying to make up for the earlier tension. A grandmother in the balcony dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her hands shaking. A father in a baseball cap stood, clapping with a fierceness that said he'd seen something that mattered. A young woman in the front row turned to her mother and whispered, "That's what strength looks like." The auditorium had become a living thing, stirred awake by a moment of injustice, held steady by the weight of honor. Outside, the sun was dipping toward the Cascade Mountains, casting golden light across the campus lawn, the shadows of dogwood trees stretching long and soft. Families spilled out of the auditorium, their voices a joyful cacophony. Laughter, hugs, the click of cameras capturing graduates in their gowns. Ayanna stood near a stone fountain, its water sparkling in the evening light, her cap in hand, surrounded by classmates. Her friends were buzzing with excitement, trading stories about their plans. Grad school in Seattle, a job in Portland, a gap year backpacking through Europe. But Ayanna's mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene in the auditorium, the way her father sat unmoved, the way those men stood without hesitation. She saw her father approach, his uniform catching the light, his braid swaying slightly as he walked, his steps steady and purposeful. She broke away from her friends, her gown rustling against the grass, her diploma folder clutched in one hand. They met halfway, the noise of the crowd fading into the background, the fountain's gentle rush the only sound between them. "Dad," Ayanna said, her voice catching, her eyes searching his face. "You okay?" "I'm fine," James said, his tone soft but firm, his eyes warm with a quiet pride. "You?" Ayanna nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She glanced at the 5 men standing near a cluster of trees, talking quietly among themselves, their postures relaxed, but alert. They weren't posing for photos or seeking attention, just watching the scene with the same quiet vigilance they'd shown inside. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James followed her gaze, his expression softening. "Men who know what it means to stand up. Men I trust." Ayanna's eyes softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "They came for you." "They came for us," James corrected, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "For what this day means. For you. For me. For your mom." She hugged him, her arms tight around his shoulders, her cap falling to the grass, the beadwork catching the fading light. "I saw what happened in there," she said, her voice muffled against his uniform. "I wanted to run to you, to say something, to make them stop." "I know," James said, cutting her off gently, his hand resting on her back. "But you didn't. You walked that stage. You made your mother proud." Ayanna pulled back, her eyes glistening but her smile breaking through. She'd have been yelling louder than anyone. James chuckled, the sound warm and rare, like a melody from a forgotten song. "And fixing your beadwork the whole time. She'd have redone every stitch, made you stand still for an hour." They stood there, father and daughter, the weight of the day settling around them like a warm blanket. Marcus approached, his hands in his pockets, his denim jacket creased from the long drive. "Hell of a ceremony, Red Hawk," he said, his voice gruff but warm, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. James nodded, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "Thanks for being here." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus said, then looked at Ayanna, his expression softening. "You did good, kid. That beadwork's something else." "Your mom's work?" Ayanna grinned, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She taught me. Took me years to get it right. I'm guessing you've got some stories about my dad." Marcus laughed, a deep rumbling sound that echoed across the lawn. "More than he'd like me to tell, but I'll save him for the right moment. Maybe over some tacos." The other Green Berets joined them, their presence quiet but solid, a circle of strength around James and Ayanna. Eli clapped James on the shoulder, his scar catching the fading light, a silent reminder of their shared past. Caleb nodded, his usual stoic demeanor softened by a small smile, his eyes warm with respect. Javier and Sam stood slightly back, their eyes scanning the crowd out of habit, always watching, always ready. They didn't need to say much. Their actions in the auditorium had spoken louder than words ever could. Ayanna looked at them, her voice soft but curious. "How'd you all know to come?" Eli glanced at James, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Your dad sent a message, said it was a big day. That's all we needed." James shook his head, a rare grin breaking through. "You make it sound like I begged." "You didn't have to," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't forget." Ayanna's eyes moved from one man to the next, taking in their faces, their quiet strength. She'd heard bits of her father's stories, vague mentions of missions, a scar on his arm he never explained, a box in the garage labeled Iraq that she'd never opened. But now, those stories were standing in front of her, living and breathing. Men who dropped everything to be here, not for glory, but for loyalty. Later, in the parking lot, James and Ayanna climbed into the F-150, the cab warm from the sun, the scent of leather and pine air freshener filling the space. The photo of Nora was still tucked in James's pocket, its edges worn but its meaning untouched. Ayanna leaned back, her diploma on her lap, her beadwork cap resting beside her, the beads glinting faintly in the evening light. The engine rumbled to life as James turned the key, the familiar sound grounding them both, a tether to countless drives with Nora in the passenger seat, singing off-key and laughing. Ayanna looked at her father, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Why didn't you fight back in there? You just sat there, like it didn't bother you." James tapped the steering wheel, his eyes on the horizon where the mountains met the sky, their peaks glowing in the fading light. "Because I don't need to fight to prove who I am. I know my place, I know my worth, and so do the people who matter." Ayanna nodded, staring out the window at the campus fading in the distance, the stone fountain now a speck in the rearview mirror. "Those guys, they didn't even hesitate. They just stood up, like they'd been waiting for it." "They never hesitate," James said, his voice steady, a hint of pride breaking through. "Real strength isn't about shouting. It's about showing up, staying steady, and letting your actions speak." She turned to him, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. I want to be like that." "You already are," James said, his tone firm but gentle, his eyes meeting hers for a moment before returning to the road. "You walked that stage with grace, even when you saw what was happening. You didn't let anger steal your moment. That's strength." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo of Nora and Ayanna, unfolding it carefully, his fingers tracing the worn edges. "I carried this through Fallujah," he said, his voice low, heavy with memory. "Through losing your mom, through every long night. Not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me what's worth protecting." Ayanna took the photo, her fingers brushing her mother's face, the star quilt vibrant even in the faded image. "You always knew who had your back," she said, her voice catching. James smiled, a rare, full smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "I didn't need to know. I just had faith. Real men don't vanish when things get uncomfortable. They show up and they stand." Ayanna nodded, her throat tight, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I want to make you proud. And Mom." "You already have," James said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Every day, every step you took to get here, every bead you sewed on that cap. That's you, Ayanna. That's us." Outside the truck, the last of the families were loading up their cars, their voices fading into the evening, the campus now quiet under the golden light. The Green Berets had already left, their vehicles disappearing into the distance, their presence lingering in the air like a promise kept. Marcus gave one last look toward the F-150 before driving off, a silent nod of respect across the lot. James returned it, his hand resting on the steering wheel, a quiet acknowledgement of something permanent. "So what now?" Ayanna asked, her voice lighter now, a smile breaking through. James turned the truck onto the road, the mountains looming ahead, their peaks catching the last rays of sunlight. "Now we drive home. You pick dinner." Ayanna grinned, her eyes sparkling, the weight of the day lifting slightly. "Tacos, the good ones, from that place by the river." James chuckled, the sound warm and familiar, like a memory of Nora's laughter. "Your mom's favorite." "Done." As they pulled out of the lot, the campus faded behind them, the stone fountain and blooming dogwoods shrinking in the rearview mirror. But the memory of what happened in that auditorium would linger, for James, for Ayanna, for everyone who witnessed it. It wasn't just a graduation, it was a lesson in dignity, in loyalty, in the quiet power of standing firm. Some people raise their voices to be heard, others simply stand, and the world can't look away. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to see what true strength looks like. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what matters most.